Stood in the marble lobby of Whitfield and Hayes law offices in downtown Boston, holding a single brass key in my palm. It was old. The kind of brass that's gone soft and dark at the edges from being touched a lot over a lot of years. There was a number stamped into the head of it, 4471. And underneath that number, scratched in so faintly I almost missed it, were two letters. M.E. My initials. Margaret Ellis. My grandmother had done that herself. I knew her handwriting the way you know your own mother's voice on the phone, and I just stood there in that lobby with all that cold Italian marble around me, while my brother's laugh echoed off the walls behind me, and I thought, she knew. She knew exactly what she was doing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Margaret Ellis, and 3 weeks before I'm telling you this, my grandmother died. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. If you live anywhere near Boston, or honestly anywhere in New England, you've probably heard of her. Whitfield Holdings owned about half of Back Bay at one point. Real estate, hotels, a small bank that got bought up by Citizens in the 90s. My grandfather built it from nothing in the 50s, and after he died in 2008, my grandmother ran it herself until she was 84 years old. She was small, maybe 5'1". White hair she kept short, and she had the bluest eyes I've ever seen on a person in my life. She raised me mostly, not officially. Officially, I grew up in Wellesley with my parents and my older brother Caleb, in a house with a circular driveway and a tennis court out back that nobody used. But every Saturday from the time I was about 6, my grandmother would pull up in her old green Volvo and take me to her house on Beacon Hill. We'd bake. We'd read in her library. She taught me to play gin rummy when I was 8, and by the time I was 12, I was beating her enough that I think she actually meant it when she got mad about it. My family didn't really like that. I think it's important you understand something about my family before I tell you what happened at the reading of the will. My father is a man named Richard Ellis. He married into the Whitfield money. He runs, or ran, a hedge fund called Ellis Capital, that's based out of an office in the Peru. My mother is Diane, who is my grandmother's only daughter, and who spent most of my childhood at charity galas and on the board of the Museum of Fine Arts. Caleb is 3 years older than me. He went to Phillips Exeter, then Harvard Business School. He works at my dad's fund. He's married to a woman named Whitney, who has very blonde hair and a very large engagement ring and a laugh that sounds like a wind chime someone is shaking on purpose. Then there's me. I went to public school in Wellesley until 8th grade, when my mother decided it was embarrassing. I went to Dana Hall for high school. I got into a few good colleges. I picked the University of Vermont because I wanted to be far away from all of them, and I studied English literature, which my father referred to, every single Thanksgiving for 4 years, as your little hobby degree. After college, I worked at a nonprofit in Burlington that helped resettle refugee families. I made $41,000 a year. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a thrift store. I drove a 2009 Subaru Outback with a cracked passenger side mirror that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. I was 29 years old. Caleb made about $900,000 a year, last I'd heard. He brought it up a lot. My grandmother had a stroke on a Tuesday in October. She was alone in her kitchen on Beacon Hill making tea. Her housekeeper Imelda found her about 40 minutes later. They took her to Mass General. She lived for 3 more days, and I sat next to her bed for every hour I was allowed to. I read to her from a book of poems she liked, by Mary Oliver. I held her hand. On the last morning, she opened her eyes and looked at me and squeezed my fingers once, very hard, and whispered something I couldn't quite hear. I leaned in and asked her to say it again. She said, "It's all there, sweetheart." I made sure. I didn't know what that meant. I thought she was confused. She died about an hour later. The funeral was at Trinity Church in Copley Square. It was very crowded. A lot of people you'd recognize from the Globe Society pages were there. The governor sent flowers. My mother wore a black Oscar de la Renta dress that I knew, because I'd been with her once when she bought it, cost about $6,000. She did not cry exactly, but she dabbed at her eyes a lot in a way that made it look like she was crying without ruining her makeup. I cried. I cried so much that my eyes were swollen the next day. Caleb came up to me at the reception at the Ritz and put his hand on my shoulder, And for 1 second I thought he was going to say something kind, and he said, "Try to pull it together, Mags. You're being a lot." My father, when I went to him at the funeral, didn't even hug me. He gave me a short nod, the kind he gives the doorman at his building, and went back to a conversation with two men in identical navy suits about something to do with municipal bonds. I want you to understand. My grandmother had just died, the person who raised me in every way that mattered, and in the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton on Avery Street, my father shook my hand. He shook my hand. Like I was a colleague. That was the moment, I think, that something inside me started to go quiet. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks later at the offices of Whitfield and Hayes. The firm was named for my grandfather. He'd founded it with his college roommate. They handled all the family business. The senior partner now was a man named Arthur Hayes Jr., who was about 70 and who had known my grandmother for 40 years. We all arrived in separate cars. My parents in my father's Range Rover, Caleb and Whitney in his Porsche Cayenne. I drove the Subaru in from Burlington that morning in the rain, and I paid $18 to park in a garage on Boylston, and my hands were a little shaky when I walked into the lobby. The conference room was on the 11th floor. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the commune. There was a pitcher of ice water and 4 glasses on the table, even though there were 6 of us. The 4th chair sat there with no glass. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything. Arthur came in. He was wearing a charcoal suit and he was carrying a leather folder. He shook my father's hand, my mother's hand, Caleb's hand. He gave Whitney a brief, polite smile. When he got to me, he stopped. He took my hand in both of his and held it for a second, and he said very quietly, "I'm so sorry, Margaret. She loved you very much." My mother's face did a small thing, a little tightening at the corners of her mouth. I don't think anyone else saw it. We sat down. Arthur opened the folder. He read for a while in the formal way they have to. The I, Eleanor Margaret Whitfield, being of sound mind part. The dates. The witnesses. My mother was already leaning forward in her seat. Whitney was looking at her nails. Caleb had his arms crossed over his chest in that way he does when he's pretending to be patient. Then Arthur got to the bequests. To my daughter Diane Whitfield Ellis, the property at 47 Mount Vernon Street, Boston, including all furnishings and contents not otherwise specified. Liquid assets in the amount of $12 million to be transferred from the Whitfield Family Trust. The 1962 Mercedes 220 SE, as we discussed. My mother actually exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath. To my son-in-law Richard Ellis, the property at 18 Salt Pond Lane, Edgartown, Massachusetts. Liquid assets in the amount of $3 million. My father didn't react. He just nodded slightly, like a man receiving a fair grade on a test. To my grandson, Caleb Whitfield Ellis, the property at 4 Acorn Street, Boston. Liquid assets in the amount of $8 million. The shares I hold in Whitfield Holdings, LLC, Class B, totaling approximately $15 million at the most recent valuation. Caleb leaned back in his chair. He looked at Whitney. Whitney's hand went to her mouth like she was surprised. But she wasn't surprised. You could see in her eyes she'd been hoping for more. To Caleb's wife, Whitney Ashford Ellis. The diamond and sapphire brooch that belonged to my mother. Liquid assets in the amount of $500,000. Whitney did look surprised by that one. She glanced at Caleb. Caleb gave her a tight smile. Arthur paused. He took a sip of water. He turned to the next page. To my granddaughter, Margaret Eleanor Ellis. I felt my mother shift in her seat. I felt Caleb's eyes move to me. I leave the contents of safe deposit box number 4471 at the State Street Trust on Court Street, the access key to which is enclosed with this document. I leave her also the sum of $100 in cash, which is to be presented to her at this reading. There was a silence. Arthur reached into the folder. He took out a small white envelope. He slid it across the long, polished table to me. I picked it up. I could feel the shape of the key through the paper, and folded behind it 2 crisp $50 bills, $100, and a key. That was it. I looked up. My mother was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before in my life. It was something between confusion and barely concealed delight. Caleb's mouth was open a little. And then he laughed. He actually laughed. He put his hand over his mouth like he was trying to be polite, but his shoulders were shaking and he said, oh my God, that's amazing." Whitney was looking at me with a kind of pity that was worse than the laughing. My father said, "Well." That was it, just well. And he started gathering his things. I didn't say anything. I sat there with the envelope in my hand and I felt every cell in my body get very still. And I thought about my grandmother in her hospital bed squeezing my fingers and whispering, "It's all there, sweetheart." I made sure. I looked at the bills, 250s, brand new, the kind you get from the bank in a clean strap. And I noticed, on the edge of one of them, the smallest, faintest pencil mark, a tiny circle drawn around the serial number. My grandmother's pencil. I would have known it anywhere. I don't know what my face did, but Arthur was watching me. And when I looked up at him, just for a second, he gave me a very small nod. It was so quick that I wasn't even sure I'd seen it. But I had. My mother stood up. She came around the table. She put her hand on my shoulder and she said in her best charity gala voice, "Sweetheart, I know this is hard. We'll talk about it. I'm sure Mother had her reasons." And she squeezed and she walked out. Caleb walked past me on his way to the door. He leaned down and he said quietly enough that only I could hear, "Maybe you should have called her more, Mags." He'd called her 3 times in the last year. I knew because she told me. Once on her birthday and twice when he wanted something. I didn't answer him. I just sat there. When they were all gone, Arthur came around the table and sat down in the chair next to mine. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "Your grandmother gave me very specific instructions. I'm to wait until the others have left, and then I'm to give you this." He handed me a sealed letter. My name was on the front in her handwriting. "Take your time," he said. "I'll be in my office down the hall. There's no rush." He stood up and he walked out. He closed the door very quietly behind him. I sat in that conference room for a long time, maybe 20 minutes. I held the letter in my lap and I looked out at the gold dome of the State House across the common, and I let myself cry for about 3 minutes, the way I'd needed to since the funeral. Then I wiped my face on my sleeve and I opened the letter. It was 4 pages, handwritten on her cream-colored stationery with the dark blue EMW monogram at the top. "My darling girl, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have just sat through what I expect was one of the more humiliating mornings of your life. I am so sorry. I want you to know that I spent a great deal of time thinking about whether to do it this way, and in the end, I decided that I needed to see, or rather to make sure you would see, exactly who they are. I needed there to be no doubt left in your mind. You have always been quiet, Margaret. You have always been the one who watches. I have watched you watch them your whole life and absorb their unkindness and never raise your voice. I admire it more than you know. But I also know that it has cost you, and I refuse to let my death cost you anything more. Now, to business. You will recall I asked you years ago to humor me by signing some papers. You signed them in my study one afternoon when you were 19. You barely looked at them. I told you it was tax paperwork. It was not. What you signed that day was the establishment of a separate trust, called the Whitfield Margaret Trust, with you as the sole beneficiary. For the last 10 years, I have been quietly transferring assets into that trust. The Beacon Hill house your grandfather and I lived in for 47 years, which I am leaving to your mother on paper but which has, in fact, been owned by your trust since 2018. Your mother has the right to occupy it during her lifetime. Upon her death, it reverts to you, free and clear. It is currently valued at approximately $14 million. The shares of Whitfield Holdings I am leaving to your brother are Class B. They are voting shares, yes, but they are non-controlling. The Class A shares, which represent controlling interest in the company and approximately 62% of its total value, have been held in your trust since 2019. I did not tell anyone. Not your mother. Not your father. Certainly not your brother. The current valuation of your Class A position is approximately $41 million. The contents of the safe deposit box at State Street Trust include the original trust documents, my personal letters to you, my mother's engagement ring, and a collection of bearer bonds your grandfather purchased in the 1970s, which I have had appraised at just over $2 million. The $100 is, I admit, a small joke at their expense. I wanted them to see you receive almost nothing. I wanted them to react. I wanted you to see them react. Because, my love, the rest of your life is going to be a series of decisions about who you allow close to you, and I needed you to start that life with absolute clarity about who they have always been. Arthur Hayes has been my attorney for 38 years. He is also yours now. He will explain everything. He will help you with whatever you decide to do. One last thing. I want you to know that I am not asking you to fight them. I am not asking you to confront them or shame them or even tell them what you now know. You may choose to do none of those things. You may choose to walk out of that office today and never tell them. That is your right. The money is yours. The choices are yours. All of it is yours, because you alone of all of them were mine. I love you. I have always loved you. Please go and live a life that is large and quiet and your own. All my love forever, Gran. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. Then I sat there for a long time looking out the window. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant. I didn't. What I felt was something more complicated than that. I felt a grief that was somehow even bigger now than it had been an hour ago. Because she had seen them. She had seen everything. And she had been carrying it, quietly, the same way I had been carrying it for years. And she had loved me enough to spend the last decade of her life making sure I would be free of them. I went to Arthur's office. He stood up when I came in. I sat down across from him and I just said, "How long have you known?" "Since the beginning," he said. "Your grandmother and I set up the original trust the day after your 19th birthday. Why didn't she ever tell me?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said, "I asked her that once. She said she didn't want you to grow up thinking you were rich. She said the worst thing that ever happened to your mother and your brother was knowing, from the time they could understand it, that they would never have to work for anything. She said she wanted you to become a person first." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. Arthur slid a folder across his desk. "Whenever you're ready," he said, "we can go to State Street Trust and open the box. It's 2 blocks from here." We went that afternoon. The bank was an old one, the kind with high ceilings and a security desk staffed by a man named Wallace who wore a uniform that looked like it was from another decade. Arthur signed me in. We went down a flight of stairs and through a heavy door into a small room. A bank officer brought out box 4471. She was a woman in her 50s, very efficient. She set the box on the table. She looked at the form, looked at me, looked at the form again, and she said, "Margaret Eleanor Ellis. Yes, you're the sole signatory on this box. Yes." She paused. She looked at her colleague through the glass for a half second. I realized later it was because the trust documents had flagged something on her screen. She said, "I'll need you to follow me to my supervisor's office. There are some additional documents to sign." We went up to the 3rd floor. Her supervisor was a man in his 60s named Greg Whelan. He stood up when I walked in, and he looked at me, and I'd swear to you he went pale. Just for a second. Then he composed his face and he said, "Ms. Ellis, we've been expecting you for some time. Please sit down." He had the rest of the paperwork ready in a stack 2 inches thick. Trust, transfer, confirmations. Brokerage account access. Wire authorization. Tax documents for the previous fiscal years. It took an hour to sign all of it. When we were done, he stood up to walk us out. At the door, he said, "Ms. Ellis, I knew your grandmother for 22 years. She was the most formidable client this branch has ever had. She told me, the last time she was in, that you were the only person she ever met who reminded her of herself." I didn't know what to say to that. I just said, "Thank you." He nodded. He shook my hand. And he said, very quietly, "She also said that when you came in, I should tell you that she was sorry it had to be done this way. And that she hoped you would understand." I understood. I drove back to Burlington that night. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Caleb. I went home to my apartment above the thrift store. I sat on my secondhand couch with my cat Buster, and I made myself a peanut butter sandwich, and I thought about my grandmother. In the weeks that followed, I did some things slowly. I quit the nonprofit, but not until I had hired and trained my replacement, which took 4 months. I gave them a donation, anonymously, that doubled their annual budget for the next 10 years. I bought my apartment building from the man who owned it, fixed the roof, and lowered everyone's rent. I bought a house outside Burlington with a view of the mountains and an apple orchard in the back. I kept the Subaru. I fixed the mirror, finally. I didn't tell my family any of this. My mother called me, 6 weeks after the reading, and asked if I'd like to come down and talk about my future. She had heard somewhere that I'd left the nonprofit. I told her I was fine. I was thinking about my options. She suggested I move back to Wellesley. She said there was a room for me. She said in a very gentle voice, "Sweetheart, your grandmother left you almost nothing. You can't just drift." I said, "I'm not drifting, Mom. I'm okay." Caleb texted me about a month after that. He'd been trying to push through some kind of restructuring at Whitfield Holdings, and apparently a controlling vote had blocked it, and he was furious, and he didn't know where the vote had come from. He texted me, "Did Gran ever talk to you about the company?" I wrote back, "No, it wasn't a lie. Sheep didn't talk about it. She wrote about it." I never told them. I haven't told them yet. Some days I think I will. Some days I think I won't. My grandmother told me it was my choice, and she meant it. What I will tell you is this: there is a kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly what someone is, and not having to argue with them about it anymore. My family is not going to change. My mother is going to keep her dinners and her dresses. My father is going to keep his fund. Caleb is going to keep pushing buttons that don't connect to anything, and he's going to keep wondering why his life feels like it isn't quite his. Whitney is going to keep laughing her wind chime laugh, and I'm going to live in my house outside Burlington with my cat and my apple trees, and I'm going to write the book my grandmother always told me I had in me, and I'm going to be finally free of all of them in a way I never thought I would get to be. The key sits in a small dish on my kitchen windowsill. I see it every morning when I make my coffee. 4471. With my initials scratched into the brass by an 84-year-old woman who loved me in the last quiet act of a long, quiet life. She made sure. She really did. I think about that morning a lot. The conference room on the 11th floor. The pitcher of ice water with only 4 glasses on the table. My brother's laugh bouncing off the marble in the lobby afterward. And I think, the older I get, the more I understand that nothing about that day was random. None of it. My grandmother spent the last 10 years of her life building something quietly. She didn't argue with my mother about how I was treated. She didn't lecture my father. She didn't shame Caleb at Thanksgiving the way someone with less patience might have. She just watched. She watched, and she planned, and she signed papers in her study on afternoons when nobody was paying attention. Every cruel little remark at a holiday dinner. Every time my father shook my hand instead of hugging me. Every time my brother laughed at my hobby degree, she was filing it away. And she was answering it, not with words, with paperwork. That, to me, is what wisdom actually looks like. Not the clever comeback. Not the dramatic speech at the funeral. The quiet, patient work of making sure the people you love will be safe long after you can't protect them anymore. I also think about cause and effect a lot now. My mother spent 40 years performing love instead of practicing it, and on the day her own mother's will was read, her face couldn't hide what was underneath. My brother spent his whole life believing he was entitled to more, and he is now sitting on shares that don't actually let him do the thing he most wants to do. My father shook my hand at a funeral, and he will never know that the woman whose money he married saw straight through him from the very first dinner. None of that is punishment. It's just the bill coming due for who they chose to be, over and over for decades. And me, I lived for 29 years on $41,000 a year in an apartment above a thrift store. And I learned how to be a person. I learned how to be quiet without being small. I learned that you don't have to win the argument in the room. You just have to keep being who you are until time does the rest. That's what my grandmother gave me. More than the money. The money is just the proof. If there's anything I want to pass on from any of this, it's that strength almost never looks the way the movies tell you it does. It usually looks like sitting still in a chair while someone laughs at you, because you know something they don't, and you don't owe them the knowing. Be patient. Be honest. Pay attention to who shows up for you when there's nothing in it for them. And when somebody quiet in your life squeezes your hand and tells you they made sure, believe them. They probably did.